Welcome to the next podcast episode for Michael Horner and his series of podcasts we are looking at on the question of how did we get here? And Michael will just add to that just shortly a little bit. I'm Kirk Durston, one of your co-hosts here with Michael. And welcome, Michael. Good to see you back here, and I'm looking forward to what you have for us today.
Yeah, good to see you, Turk. Turk.
That's no problem.
You'll see today's topic. We are talking about Turkey and Turks a little bit.
Yeah, the Turks do get involved a little
It
bit.
just came out. Yeah. So, Kirk, thanks for your willingness to do this with me. I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to covering today's topics because they are two very serious topics, which have done a lot of damage, I think, to people's understanding of the history of the impact of Christianity on culture, on the world. And it's another one of these areas where we need to set the record straight.
Yeah, well, just a few minutes ago, I received an invitation to speak at a couple of different universities that are joining together. And the question is how the Christian faith is still worth following given the historical harms it's been a part of, which I cringe just to read the question because the perception out there is kind of as the question suggests, when in fact, the fact of history says it's not all harms. In fact, the good has actually outweighed the harms, but there are harms. So we are actually taking that in this series here. We're looking at both the good and the bad. And today we're looking at the harms, some of the harms done.
Yeah. That title of the invitation confirms my hypothesis, which is that for a large number of people in our culture, maybe the vast majority, one part of their worldview is this assumption that Christianity is harmful for human flourishing. And a lot of it is based on false narratives that we've been taught for the last 250 years. But recent historical research is showing that they are based on exaggerations and hyperbole. And for our listeners, just to remind them what we covered at the beginning last week, for each of these alleged blemishes in the history of Christianity, and blemishes might even be too soft a word to use, atrocities, maybe a more accurate word in some cases, especially in today's two that we're going to cover. We are trying to ultimately answer the question, do these events justify drawing the conclusion that Christianity is harmful to human flourishing or not? And I'm going to review again the 4 points that I'm using to respond to each one of these events based on having studied them. One is that I'm going to admit right up front that yes, some horrible things did happen. Two, we're also going to point out that major exaggerations in the narrative that we've been told have taken place in these events. Third, we will see that there are mitigating circumstances which are not enough to justify them, but they should be enough to help us sort of walk in the shoes of the people who did some of these things and help us see that, you know what, maybe I wouldn't have done much differently. And then fourthly, that ultimately these behaviors are not rooted in the teachings of Jesus and his early followers. They are an exception. They are in contrast, in contradiction to those teachings. And that's the important point, because we can admit Christians have done bad things, but that doesn't justify the conclusion that Christianity, as represented by the teachings of Jesus and his earliest followers, are harmful for human flourishing. Mm-hmm. The evidence actually, I think, shows quite the opposite. But we do have to deal with these negative blemishes, and the first one today is going to be the Crusades.
Yeah, well, we definitely have to deal with those, and I think people would we would be remiss if we didn't. We do have to get this out on the table. So yeah, the Crusades are one in fact, where did I just read that? Yeah, I think there's been bad things. A lot said about that, but the most of it, as you mentioned, has been not rooted in solid historical sources or has been grossly exaggerated. But anyways, let's dive into the Crusades. Let's grab
Right.
the bull by the horns and just see what we have to see.
Okay. In 2001, shortly after the 9/11 attacks, former President Bill Clinton delivered a speech, and he was discussing the response that the West was having to those attacks on September 11th. And the speech contained a reference, a very significant reference to the Crusades. Clinton observed that, quote, when the Christian soldiers took Jerusalem, and this, by the way, this would have been in 1099, they proceeded to kill every woman and child who was Muslim on the Temple Mount, end of quote. And he cited the contemporaneous descriptions of the event, another quote, as describing soldiers walking on the Temple Mount with blood running up to their knees. And so Clinton said emphatically, this story is still being told today in the Middle East, and we are still paying for it. So that's typical of the narrative now throughout the world.
Now, what
About
was the source for
Crusades.
that?
It is from an article by Paul Crawford. Just let me scroll down here and I can get it exactly for you. And then I'll come up again. Yes, here it is. In an article called Four Myths About the Crusades by Paul F. Crawford, published in First Principles, April 5th, 2011.
No, I meant what was Bill Clinton's source for that
Uh,
information?
good question. According to Paul Crawford and Rodney Stark, who we're going to look at, it was a Christian, and it was contemporaneous, as Clinton said, but he was writing it more like a conquering war hero type of thing, like from the ancient times, where they would deliberately exaggerate the victory. So
Embellish.
and I'm gonna later on at the end I'm gonna mention this. Might as well mention it now. But the idea of walking knee deep in blood is physically impossible. And people recognize that this is an embellishment and exaggeration, but still something horribly wrong happened at that time.
Okay.
And it has affected. As we move towards the end here, I'm going to come back to the effect that the Crusades have had on Muslim thinking as our last point, after we discuss some of the way that Christians think about it. Because what Clinton described there is really the typical sort of secular narrative, and not just secular, but the Islamic narrative that is being perpetrated now. Although what's interesting is it was not the narrative of Muslims 150 years ago or before. But the Crusades are depicted as a deplorably violent episode in which sort of thuggish Westerners trundled off unprovoked to murder and pillage peace-loving and sophisticated Muslims. So there's two narratives by Christian scholars these days. They've approached it in two ways, and I think there's truth in both, and so we'll discuss them both briefly. And the first one is mainly given by Catholic scholars, and Rodney Stark, who I've mentioned before, who was an agnostic before he studied the history of Christianity. He later became a Christian and later a Catholic as a result of his studies, and he also takes this approach. And the first major point here that they emphasize is that the Crusades were not unprovoked. That's the key point. They were a response to a call for help. And I think in our time, this is a lot easier for us to understand when Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine sent out a call for help that has been met by Western nations with billions of dollars and with weapons, not with sending soldiers, but it was a call for help because of an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. So there were actually 7 different crusades, and tens of thousands of people died in them. But they were initially a response to 400 previous years of Muslim atrocities and conquest, and many requests for help from Eastern Christians. Christianity at that time had 5 centers um, of sort of episcopal rule, or rule by the bishops. Each of these 5 centers had a bishop who ruled these 5 areas, and these are the 5 centers of Christianity: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. And the Muslims had brutally conquered 3 out of the 5 centers: Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. And they had tried and attacked the other 2, Constantinople and Rome, in the centuries leading up to the Crusades, which began in the 11th century. They were on the verge of capturing Constantinople now, leaving only Rome as the last Christian episcopal jurisdiction free from Islamic subjugation. So, I'm not going to go into a lot of description of the atrocities by either side here. Clinton's description was enough. I guess I will give a little bit in a moment here, coming from the other side, but there was lots of atrocities that were done. The Crusaders, who eventually went to help, were not drafted. There was no draft. Their participation was voluntary. And this is interesting to think about. Why in the world would they go? They had to be persuaded. And the only way they could be persuaded was by preaching, really. There was no other basis for persuading them to go. The typical narrative is that they were motivated by fortune and greed. But, and although there's a few cases of people who certainly took advantage of opportunities that arise during war, that was not the major motivation for the vast majority of the Crusaders. Because for most of them, it actually cost them and their families their fortunes to actually go there. We're talking about a long walk from Central Europe to the border of the Mediterranean, eastern border or western border, eastern border of the Mediterranean Sea, western border of the land there. They were motivated by laying their lives down to liberate Jerusalem for the honor of God and the church, and for their brothers and sisters who were suffering under Muslim occupation and were asking for help. But there was another motivating factor, and this is where the problem comes in for other Christian views, and a problem comes in for me. They were also motivated by their own perceived need for penance. Now, penance means the opportunities for voluntary self-punishment, which was viewed as a payment for their sins. This was part of the theology of the Catholic Church at that time, and many of the warrior class, people who have been brought up, trained as soldiers, they knew they had some pretty big sins to pay for. And these crusades then provided significant opportunities for them to earn this merit that would pay for those sins. And crusading just was an opportunity for that. So the point to make here is that these crusades were not unprovoked. People did not go there to get rich, but it was out of charity and self-sacrifice, at least in the beginning, and in their minds. They went for religious reasons, and they knowingly paid an immense price in money and lives for their ventures. So that's the sort of first Christian view that mainly comes from Catholic scholars. And I think their point that this was unprovoked is extremely important, and that they were not going out of greed and to try to get rich, but many of them became paupers if they survived. Now, the second view, John Dixon, who's a historian from Australia, he's evangelical Anglican. He takes a more dim view of it. He says what was going on here with Crusades, despite what the Catholic view is saying, there was a mixing, like an unholy mixing of God and torture that should never be brought together. A mixing of the church and the state. And then there was a recruiting by offering pardon for sins and actually eternal life. And then inverting the meaning of the cross back to being a symbol of violence after Jesus and the early Christians had turned it from a symbol of violence and torture into a sign of love. The Crusaders were turning it back. So this theology of penance here is interesting. It's a serious mistaken theology, in my opinion. The idea of penance and indulgences, that you're paying for your own sins to some degree. And with the Crusades, the Pope actually promised 100% washing away of one's sins. So
this
actually guarantee eternal life.
those sorts of things, like recruiting by offering a pardon for sins and eternal life, almost makes it something like a holy war, or what people might say was a holy war. That is, the rewards might be eternal life, and that strikes me as being parallel to, in a way, to the Islamic belief that if you were killed in a holy war, then you do have eternal life. And so there seems to be almost similar thinking on both sides.
Strong similarities there. That's right. Also, there was this twisted version of a noble idea of laying down one's life for one's friends, including laying it down for Christ himself, but doing so by killing his enemies in the name of the cross. I mean, Jesus talked about that's the greatest love you can show is laying down your life for your friend.
It's actually totally opposite to what Jesus taught.
You do it by killing your enemies in the name of the cross. And then the use of indulgences. People could purchase sort of pardon for their sins that lasted a certain length of time. I mean, that very thing just got worse, and that's what actually led to the Reformation and really triggered the ire of Martin Luther and many others. So I think that mistaken theology got twisted up with some good teaching of Jesus and became a basis for that led to significant blemishes on the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. Now let's look at some other accusations that are commonly made about the Crusades in the typical narrative today. One of them is that the Crusades were an attempt to convert people to Christianity. That was their whole attempt, and that's what we talked about last time: the use of force and violence versus persuasion. And we saw that there was a back and forth in the church about that, but that the earliest church teaching was peaceful persuasion by words, not persuasion by any other method. And that despite their times, like when Charlemagne was actually trying to spread Christianity by the sword, it was the church leaders that stopped him and got that turned around, and education became the main way of doing that. So is it true that the Crusades were just now reverting back to spreading Christianity by the sword? It's just not true. According to Rodney Stark, he says the Crusaders made no attempt to impose Christianity on the Muslims. In fact, Muslims who lived in Crusader I territories were generally allowed to retain their property and livelihood and always retain their religion. Now, in the 13th century, so that's a couple hundred years later, some Franciscans initiated conversion efforts among the Muslims, but they were based on peaceful persuasion only. And they were actually quite unsuccessful, and they were soon abandoned. So in generally, the church opposed any linkage between crusading and conversion. So that's just one of those Enlightenment narrative points. Maybe, I'm not sure about this particular one, but maybe even originally initiated by Protestant Christians, because many of these exaggerations about Catholic behavior did come up during the Reformation by Protestants trying to make the Catholics look as bad as possible, trying to make it look like nothing good had happened in the previous 1,000 years. And history just shows that that is not the case, and we've talked about that in previous episodes. So the next one is colonialism. One of the claims is, well, look, this is just an attempt at colonialism. And they point to the creation of 4 states afterwards. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, Tripoli, Edessa, and there's one more, it's just Antioch, I think. And together they're called the Outremer. But the Outremer was never a European colony. They were 4 independent states, and they were fully independent. And a colony is normally defined as a place that is politically directed and economically exploited by the homeland. Well, with that definition, these Crusader states, the Outremer, were not colonies at all. The opposite was going on. They remained dependent on Christendom for men and money, and they endured as states as long as Christendom retained enough interest to keep supplying them. So Christendom was supplying these states with resources, people and financial resources. And when they finally stopped doing that, the states basically collapsed. So it wasn't colonialism in any sense. What about war crimes? Well, yes, if we're judging them by the Geneva Convention, which, by the way, is the only attempt in all of human history by any culture to try and apply standards of justice in war, and it was initiated by a Christian, Henri Dunant, in the 19th century. There were horrible atrocities, but again, exaggerations took place in reporting. As I mentioned before, blood knee-deep on the streets of Jerusalem is not even physically possible. There was brutality and savagery on both sides, like all medieval wars. This was typical. But the worst actually were committed by Muslim leaders like Saladin, who personally participated in butchering some of the captured knights and then sat back and enjoyed watching the execution of the rest of them. And secondly, Baybar, another Muslim leader, and his followers are called Baybars, when they took the great city of Antioch. Even though the city surrendered after 4 days, the Baybars ordered all inhabitants, including all women and children, to be killed or enslaved. And so what followed, according to Rodney Stark, was the single greatest massacre of the entire crusading era. But the Crusaders did have that event when they won Jerusalem, and it looks like women and children were killed during that time. So Stark says, of course, the Crusaders were often cruel and bloodthirsty. After all, they had been trained from childhood to make war face to face, sword to sword. No doubt it was very, and he's being sarcastic here, unenlightened of the Crusaders to be typical feudal warriors. But Stark says it strikes me as even more unenlightened to anachronistically impose the Geneva Convention on the Crusaders while pretending that their Islamic opponents were either UN peacekeepers or hapless victims.
Yeah, that's an important point. Neither side is better than the other. In fact, as you pointed out, the single greatest massacre was not done by the Crusaders at Antioch, for example. But it's not a question of who killed the most or who massacred the most. I think we can, as you pointed out many times, say there's a major, major departure from the teachings of Jesus Christ and what was done in the name of Christianity. Let's say, for example, in the Crusades, major departure. So we cannot use, let's say, what people do in contradiction to the teachings of Jesus Christ to therefore conclude that the teachings of Jesus Christ have caused great harm. No, it's actually quite the opposite. It actually exposes or gives you an objective basis for saying that is flat out not what Jesus taught, like killing your enemies, for example.
Exactly.
That's an important point to make.
It is. Thank you for making it for me. That's excellent.
Well, you've made it many times already, Michael. I just think it's so important, though, that I just see it happening all the time where some historical event where Christians did something contrary to the teachings of Christ is used as an excuse for rejecting Christianity. And my question is always, well, is that actually what Jesus taught? Is that what he taught? And most of the time they'll pause and they'll say, no, not really. Then
Right.
you can't reject Christ on the basis of what these people do.
And we can make the further point, too, that Rebecca McLaughlin makes in her book, Confronting Christianity, where she covers many of these blemishes on the Christian name. She says, the ethical standards by which we judge episodes of violence, like the Crusades, in all their complexity, are those given to us by Christianity, which breaks down the them and us of tribal ethics and insists on the humanity and worth of one's enemies. And that's right. If we want to stand firm on this was wrong, in war, the only basis that we have for it in all of human history is the teachings that come from Jesus. And if the Crusades are compared to other wars throughout history, there's really not too much unusual about them, really. And they shouldn't invite any more criticism than that which we should give to other wars. But the fact that we do recognize that there were problems with what was done with the Crusades is precisely because we're under the influence of the teachings of Jesus and Christianity in our culture. In fact, most wars should be under that same criticism.
Yeah. No, another thing I've observed is that the Crusades and the things that were done by people who would at least insist and profess that they were Christians, and maybe even well-meaningly so. But that particular series of wars is then there's some sort of a leap made to all wars. So I've actually heard numerous times that religion is the cause of most, if not all, wars. And it's usually on the basis of the Crusades. So let's say some war between, when you actually start thinking about it, it becomes a little absurd, especially when you see great wars where really there wasn't a lot of Christianity involved on either side. But that's another thing to be cautious of, is the extrapolating or making the leap that there were Christians involved in this one, therefore, or it was a religious war between Christians and Muslims, therefore all wars are like that, when in fact that's just simply not the case. In fact, if you look at who does the most killing in this world, the USSR under Stalin and communist China have a very poor track record that makes the Crusades look like rather mild by comparison. And those were not Christian or religion fueled.
You and I both know that the research done by Rummel, I think his name is,
Yeah,
concluded that
Rudolf Rummel.
of all the wars in history, only 7% have a religious cause to them, and half of those is the cause is Islam. And so it's only like 3% or 3.5% of wars in the world were caused by religion other than Islam. I mean, it's
Mhm.
just a small amount, especially when you compare it to communism in the 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah, no, his research is fascinating, and I've spent a fair amount of time going through it on various issues.
Let's tackle another common uh, teaching about the Crusades, and that is that the Crusades is actually what taught Muslims to hate Christians and attack Christians. If it hadn't been for the Crusades, the Muslims wouldn't feel this way about Christianity. But that forgets that the Muslims have been attacking Christians for more than 450 years before Pope Urban declared the First Crusade. The Crusades were a response to the Muslims hating and attacking believers. So Stark picks up on this theme. He says, one often reads that Muslims have inherited from their medieval ancestors bitter memories of the violence of the Crusaders. And this is fascinating, this whole part here, at least to me. Nothing could be further from the truth. Before the end of the 19th century, Muslims had not shown much interest in the Crusades, looking back on them with indifference and complacency, really. Even at the time they took place, Muslim chroniclers paid very little attention to the Crusades, regarding them as invasions by a primitive, unlearned, impoverished, and un-Muslim people about whom Muslim rulers and scholars knew and cared little. That was the way the Muslims viewed the Crusades. And then Paul Crawford says, up until quite recently, Muslims remembered the Crusades as an instance in which they had beaten back a puny Western Christian attack. That was their view of it. So this was their view, generally representative of the Muslim attitude toward the Crusades before about World War One. And that's when Muslims bothered to remember the Crusades at all, which was not often, because it hadn't seemed important for them to distinguish the Crusades from any other conflicts between Christianity and Islam. So the first Muslim crusade history did not appear until 1899. By that time, the Muslim world was rediscovering the Crusades, but it was rediscovering them with a twist that they learned from Westerners. So in this modern period, then in the 19th century, there were two main European schools of thought about the Crusades. One school, epitomized by Voltaire, Gibbon, Sir Walter Scott, and in the 20th century, Sir Stephen Runciman, they saw the Crusaders as crude, greedy, aggressive barbarians who attacked civilized, peace-loving Muslims to improve their own lot. This is the Enlightenment narrative that I've been talking about with previous blemishes. The other school, was sort of more romantic and epitomized by lesser known figures, as the French writer Joseph Francois Michel, who saw the Crusades as a glorious episode in a long-standing struggle in which Christian chivalry had driven back Muslim hordes. And in addition, Western imperialists began to view the Crusaders as their predecessors. And then they began to adapt their activities, the imperialists did, in a secularized way that the original Crusaders would not have recognized or found very congenial. So at the same time of these sort of two different Western views of the Crusades, nationalism began to take root in the Muslim world. And so Arab nationalists borrowed this idea of a long-standing European campaign against them from the first European school of thought we just mentioned, missing the fact that this was a serious mischaracterization of the Crusades, and then using this distorted understanding as a way to generate support for their own agendas. And this remained the case until the mid-20th century, when, in historian Riley Smith's words, a renewed and militant pan-Islamism applied the more narrow goals of the Arab nationalists to a worldwide revival of what was then called Islamic fundamentalism, and is now sometimes referred to as jihadism. This led rather seamlessly to the rise of Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, offering a view of the Crusades so bizarre as to allow bin Laden to consider all Jews to be Crusaders. Think about that. The Jews were considered to be Crusaders, and the Crusades to be a permanent and continuous feature of the West's response to Islam. Crawford says
Well,
that's just a fantasy, a feverish fantasy by bin Laden. And the irony is that those millions of Muslims who accepted his message received that message from their perceived enemies, the West. That's the real irony here that is sad and seriously dangerous.
that's got implications even for what Bill Clinton said, because if someone in the Middle East doesn't have much of a knowledge of the Crusades, and they listen to that speech, that actually perpetuates a view of the Crusades by the West, which continues to fuel violence in the Middle East. So
Exactly.
Clinton, without realizing it, was actually supplying fuel and fodder with a highly selective quote episode from the Crusades. And well, a person has to watch what they say, because lives can be lost on the basis of what Clinton said.
I mean, you see the history of that lie. If that lie started in the Protestant Reformation, trying to make Catholicism look as bad as possible, then gets picked up by Enlightenment atheists trying to make all Christianity and even all religion look ridiculous, and then gets picked up by Muslims as fodder for them to be able to hate and attack Christians, which in their mind is just the entire West. It's that's a dangerous flow of thought, right? That's for sure.
Yeah, you can see how a small misrepresentation in the past done by, say, Protestant Christians to make Catholics look bad, a small misrepresentation or exaggeration actually in the end causes great harm to a lot more, and just like releasing a virus, but it really underscores the importance of a more fundamental principle of truth, and how free are we to mess with the truth, or use it for our own ends, or misuse it, I should say.
Right.
Twist it for our own ends.
Right. So, in summarize again, I want to make these same 4 points that I think do apply legitimately to each one of these blemishes we're discussing. And that is, first of all, to admit that, yes, Christians did some horrible things. There's no doubt about that. Secondly, there were exaggerations, though. There's no way blood runs knee deep. And there's no way that the Muslims were just peaceful, sophisticated culture that was just sitting back and was just peacefully attacked. No, they had been attacking and subjugating Christians, and had actually conquered 3 out of the 5 areas of the Christian world up to that time. Mitigations were also there, that this was not unprovoked. The attacks have been going on for 400 plus years, and the people, just like the Ukraine, and really even just like maybe Israel after the attacks in October, were asking for help, and that help us understand why some people thought that there was a need to go and help. Doesn't justify all the things that they did. Human nature takes over. I mean, war is terrible. I mean, once you enter war, it just gets ugly. It is extremely difficult to stay within ethical boundaries. But
it's a Pandora's box. Open
we
the
need
lid
to try.
and yeah.
And then fourthly, the Crusades are not an example of Christianity in practice, because this is not example of the teachings of Jesus being applied. They're an example of Jesus' teachings being ignored and actually contradicted. And so this does not justify the conclusion that, see, the Crusades prove Christianity is harmful for human flourishing. And that's the main point I'm trying to deal with right now.
Yeah. A lot to think
All
about.
right. Well, you know what? I think we're going to cut it off there rather than going into the
Okay.
Inquisitions
Yeah,
today,
we wouldn't
Kirk,
want to cut that
and
short.
trying to squeeze it in and just going too fast or cutting it off.
Mhm.
Let's just leave that for the next session. I do want our listeners to understand that we are trying to deal with this as fairly as we possibly can, trying to read both sides on these issues. It is my opinion, based on the research that I've done, that there are exaggerated and false narratives out there that have dominated the Western culture in some cases, and in some cases even beyond the Western culture, that are just lies,
Hmm.
and they are what's harmful, and that we do need to set the record straight on these. And then ultimately, we're going to ask the question: okay, if these typical examples that are used to prove that Christianity is harmful do not actually make that case very well, if at all, then how should we be looking at Christianity now, both individually and corporately, as groups, and even as nations? I think that's the question we want to discuss, towards the end of this series.
Yeah, that'll be a very important one because we're always comparing what's done with what Jesus actually taught, but we haven't actually dove into what Jesus actually taught. But that'll be a good episode there, Michael.
Okay, well, thanks, Kirk. I hope our
Thank you,
listeners
Michael.
enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and we'll see you on the next episode when we look at the Inquisitions.
All right, take care, brother.
Yeah, bye for now.
Bye.